Hi, this is Matt Alanis, a business instructor over at the Willow International Center, and today we're going to be reviewing layout, specifically making the pages that we write look inviting. A lot of the past 3 weeks we've actually spent looking at ways that we can improve our written communication, specifically the content, grammar, and different techniques associated with that. For this week we're going to look primarily at formatting the actual page. We obviously want to make that look inviting so that the readers will be engaged and interested in looking at the documents that we write. Now, over the course of this brief lecture here, we're going to cover a couple of different things specifically related to layout. First, we're going to go into briefly what layout is, what it entails. We're going to talk about different typefaces, discuss typesetting and some of the changes in the guidelines behind typesetting versus typewriting. We're going to discuss block paragraphing, headings, and lastly, utilizing bulleted lists and how to do that. There's a couple different ways. There's not necessarily one right way, but if you use one format, you have to use it consistently, and we'll go over what that looks like. So let's talk about layout real quick. When I say layout, I'm referring to the overall look of the page. Layout is extremely important. Not only does it communicate a sense of professionalism, but you're essentially providing an incentive for the reader to look at it. Remember, we discussed in weeks past that people have an opportunity and they have an ability to weigh competing interests, and in order to be able to find that your document most appealing, they are going to consider the layout. Regardless of if you believe it or not, people will essentially judge your work essentially by how it appears initially. That's why I always preach the importance of formatting resumes properly. Is no matter what the content is, people won't be able to get past the way that it looks the second that they see it. And your resume has 5 to 10 seconds for the reader to actually gauge whether or not they're going to continue even reading that. And you may have good content behind that resume, but it doesn't matter because the layout has to be important. Is important to gauge their interest and to kind of rope them in, so to speak, in order to continue to get them to read it. So good layout does a couple different things. First of which, it encourages people to read the document that you've actually written. Remember that we are trying to pique people's interest. We're trying to encourage them to look at the document. Obviously, we don't write just for fun. We write to communicate something. Next, it helps your document look very professional, and we'll give you some tools that you can do and implement right away that can increase the overall professional look of your document. And then next, it helps your readers find important information. Now, we all know that what we communicate in some type of paper or whatever our writing is may not have equal importance. There are certain things that we want to draw readers' attention to. And utilizing good layout is a way to draw your readers' attention to certain aspects of your writing that you do want to highlight, right? What are the 1 or 2 things that if your reader doesn't remember anything else that you want them to remember? And those are the things that you highlight, and we'll discuss how. So typefaces. Typefaces are the different fonts that you use when composing your written documents. Now, before you begin to write, you obviously have to pick how you're going to write. You have to choose the typeface, and we have many, many, many different typefaces to choose from. Years ago, it wasn't like that. We had relatively few, so the decision was not so difficult. The good thing is that there are a couple industry standards for typefaces that you can use in order to make your document and give it a professional look. Okay, so there are 2 types of typefaces, or 2 categories, I should say. There are what are called serif fonts, and then there are called sans serif fonts. A serif is essentially a little mark or dash that appears on the letter. Okay, and a sans serif does not have those particular markings. That's what sans actually stands for. So what I have here is a couple of examples. This first column here is written, you have the letters A, T, and M, and they're written in Times New Roman. This next column is written in Arial, 2 very common industry standards for serif and sans serif fonts. Now, initially, you probably have already picked up on what the difference between the 2 is, and that these little marks that appear on the base of the A, on the sides, and the base of the T, and on the upper portion and the base of the letter M. You'll notice that the Arial font is much cleaner. Very clean edges. There's no markings or anything like that. It's very uncluttered. Okay. Serif fonts are what you will use for the body of your writing. So for text, so when composing letters, composing emails, you will utilize a serif font such as Times New Roman. Sans serif fonts are great for headers. And the reason that they're great for using in headings is that they're very clean, and if you increase the size of the font or decrease it, it looks the same. If you start to decrease dramatically the typeface of a font from, let's say you're going to, from 12 points to maybe 8 or 6, if you're utilizing a graph or tables, then because they have the markings throughout the actual characters, it makes them look very cluttered. It can make them difficult to see. But with a sans serif font, you don't have that problem because those same markings actually don't exist. And so what people predominantly use is your sans serif fonts such as Arial for headings, because they don't detract from your ability to do just that. Now that we've kind of gone over typefaces a little bit, let's discuss some differences in typesettings. A lot of the standards that we use and a lot of the guidelines that we follow were developed when we utilized the typewriter, and they were just things that people didn't kind of adapt to, for lack of a better term there. And there's been a lot of transition in terms of what's considered to be the industry standard or a guideline, so to speak, for actual typesetting, which is the writing that we actually use with word processing softwares. One of the benefits, too, of word processing software is it takes a lot of the difficult things out of using typewriters. We don't have to worry about spacing between certain letters because a lot of word processing softwares take care of it. We don't have to worry about ellipses because as long as we type 3 dots, the word processing software will take care of it for us. So those are benefits of that we kind of take for granted. But there's a couple of things that we need to be keenly aware of. Now the first is the difference between using 1 versus 2 spaces after punctuation. Now utilizing a typewriting guideline, you would use 2 spaces after punctuation. And the reason for that is in a typewriter, you're allocating the same space for each letter, regardless of the size of that letter. Now, word processing software today obviously formats things differently depending upon the words that we write, because obviously you need to allocate more space to certain letters that are larger just naturally than you do for some of the other letters that don't take up as much space to use, like letters like I and L and different things where it's just one quick movement, versus a letter like M, which takes up a little bit more space. So they shouldn't all get the same space because it makes things look a little odd. So the standard of utilizing 2 spaces was developed for the typewriter because if you're having 1 space for each thing, and you really have a difficult time determining between where's the beginning and the end of the sentence, right? There's not a break. It looks like one consistent stream of words just progressing through your entire page. So we use 2 spaces for that very reason, to break it up, to be a signal to the reader and their eyes that there was a little bit of white space and they knew that there was a break there. Because of word processing software the way it is today, we don't need to do that anymore, because 1 space is sufficient to indicate a break because each character doesn't get the same space that it originally did utilizing a typewriter. So I encourage you to use 1 space. It is considered a guideline right now. The Chicago Writing Style Manual, which is, kind of comes up with a lot of the different rules and things that we actually follow, which was developed by typographers, is developed in mind for utilizing 1 space after punctuation. The next thing that I would discuss is in the area of underlining versus italics. Now, one thing I will mention before I go any further is that both are considered to be okay. Underlining, however, is utilized more regularly for headings. Not necessarily for throughout the body of the text. If you want to make something stand out in the body of the text, the best thing to do is utilize italics for that. Because italics doesn't stand out as much. It isn't kind of glaring to your reader that you're trying to highlight that, but it sets it apart just enough that they still can read the document and draw a little bit of attention to that without their eyes being automatically directed towards the underlined sentence and then ignoring anything else, so to speak. So like I said before, both are considered to be okay, but I would reserve underlining for headings if you are going to use them in headings, which you don't always have to, and utilizing italics for the body of the actual text. Now there's one exception to that, and the exception to that is if you're utilizing a sans serif font in italics, because if you try this on your computer right now, what'll happen is it's only going to slant the letters. If you write a serif font like Times New Roman and you change it to italics, it's actually going to change the configuration of the letters. Like the letter A, if you notice, is going to be written differently. And that's what we want because that sets it apart. So if you're utilizing Arial, which is a sans serif font, and change it to italics, the argument is that it's not going to be set apart enough to really make a difference, to really draw the reader's attention to that, because it looks too similar. So if you're utilizing a sans serif font, instead of using italics, I would encourage you to use some type of underlining, which is why you see underlining in more headings than you do the body of the text. All right, the next recommendation I have here is with regards to block paragraphing. Block paragraphing involves indentation. And a lot of times, especially when you were taught in grammar school, that you always wanted to indent the first paragraph of your writing. This is no longer considered to be necessary. The reason for it now is because the way that we write is much different. We have bulleted lists, we have headings, we have all these other things that can draw readers' attention and signal that we're on a new paragraph. Plus, when you tab over, it gives your page kind of a clumsy feel to it, because you have one indentation here and not in a bunch of other areas, and then one here, and it doesn't look very fluid. It's not appealing to the eye if you were to look at that. So what the recommendation is now is to not indent the first line of that paragraph, and instead what you do to signal to the reader that you're moving on is you add a space between paragraphs. So obviously, instead of when you press enter to write a new paragraph, you would add one extra space there to signal to the reader that you moved on to a new thought. Now, this is also good too, because you always want to incorporate some white space on your page. Whenever a reader looks at something that's just complete text, it's very intimidating and it's not very encouraging on a reader to actually go through it. So having a little bit of a break gives kind of a rest period for the reader. They can kind of collect themselves somewhat and then continue on, all the while knowing that you're going to move on to a different thought as well. Let's discuss some different types of headings here that you can use in your writing. You can use multiple headings in writing. A lot of times we think of headings and we think of the subject line. We think of the subject line in emails, in memos, in letters, and different things. But you can have multiple headings in the body of a text. Obviously, if you're not sending an email, you don't need to include multiple subject lines. But in the body of that email, if you're writing about multiple things, there's nothing wrong with including one header or one heading and prefacing what you're going over in a certain area, and then tabbing down and utilizing a different heading with different content. Because all that does to your reader is it shows them where you're going. It gives them a roadmap, if you will, so that they know where you're taking them. Remember that I, as a reader, I want to know where you're going, because I have to make a decision early on. Do I want to read through this? Is this worth my time? Those are the questions that I'm asking myself as I'm reading documents as a reader. So if I can't make that conclusion fairly soon, and if I continue to read all the while not grasping what the point is, I'm more inclined to disengage and to not continue reading. So headings is a way of not only attracting readers to certain pieces of information, but it's also a way of organizing your document and giving it a very professional look. Now, one of the things you can do, and this is very common, is utilizing informative readings. Informative readings do basically just what that says. They inform the reader about something. So instead of putting a simple two-word heading, maybe you describe something that the passage is about. So maybe, I don't know, sales have increased 15% over last year. That's information, right? That's designed to kind of spark my interest. I know that what I'm going to read after that heading is related to sales increasing 15%. Or if you have a heading about new government regulations, I know that the document is about government regulations, so to speak, specifically what it is. So informative headings should always be utilized. They're a way to catch the reader's attention, but also to inform them early on of what you're going to be talking about in the body of your text, so they don't have to sift through it and try to gather what it is you're trying to communicate. Next thing you can do is engaging headings. Engaging headings are designed to kind of capture interest in the reader. They're commonly utilized in newspaper articles. If you were to open up the newspaper and look at all of the headings, you would probably see headings that have a lot of questions and things that maybe spark your curiosity. And those are good things to do, particularly when you're trying to grab the reader's attention. You can utilize engaging headings. Like I said, a lot of times those involve questions, because obviously when we're asked a question, we want to know what the answer is. We're kind of just inclined to try and figure that out. Next is spacing between headings. I know you think this is trivial, but this matters. The conventional thought is that you would include the same space above the heading as the same space you have below the heading. But you need to be able to associate that heading with different text. So what the recommendation is to actually include the heading closer to the body of text that it's associated with, because you want people, when they look at the page, to be able to grasp, okay, what's associated with what. It's a way to stay organized. It's a way to have a very professional look on your document. So follow that when you're spacing your headings. And the last thing involves down versus up style headings, down style versus up style. This difference is pretty minute, and personally I don't really care which one you use, because both are fine. And all it means is capitalizing all of the first letters of multiple words if you're utilizing up style headings. So this first example here, human relations, is written in a down style heading. You see I've capitalized the H in human relations. I've lowercased the R in relations right there. Obviously the second example will be an example of up style. Okay, so it's capital H and capital R. It's up to you. You'll see multiple different varieties in different writing, including business writing. So I'll leave that up to you. Whichever one you choose, the only thing I will say is make sure that you're consistent. So if you have one heading that is in down style, then use the same style throughout your paper. If you use up style, then use the same style throughout your paper, but don't flip-flop between the two. You want to be consistent in what you choose. All right, let's talk about bulleted lists. Bulleted lists are very important and fairly underutilized. And the reason they're important is they're a great way of communicating more than one of something. If you have a lot of things to communicate, rather than writing a long, drawn-out sentence that's going to be 30 words long and is going to be very, very disengaging, why not break it up a little bit so you're communicating the same thing but making it easier for the reader to grasp it? So some of the things you want to use bulleted lists for: if you have more than one reason, more than one example of something, more than one recommendation for something, more than one conclusion, and more than one step. Some people ask, well, what if I want to use numbers, numbered lists? Numbered lists are fine. Typically I use them if I'm talking about steps in a process. So if it's the steps to conduct or to perform some kind of activity, I would list that from 1 to however many steps they are, because obviously they need to go in sequence to one another. It's important that you do step 1 before step 2. So that's what I would use numbered lists for. Other than that, I would stick to bulleted lists. As far as the bullets, you can use the conventional ones, the little circles there. Obviously mine, I got a little fancy here just because I'm tired of looking at those. But the conventional thought is that you would use just the standard formatted bullets and not get too fancy, because you're not sure what your reader is going to like, but there is a standard that that everyone is accustomed to seeing. So you don't want to use anything that's going to shock someone. So let's look at a couple different types of bulleted lists here real quick, and then we'll conclude the lecture. There are a number of different ways that you can do this. There are a number of different systems that you can use for punctuating bulleted lists. And similar for the up style and down style headings, I don't care which one you use, but be consistent in the one that you choose. So let's go through one, for example. An example that I wrote up here is, we need the following items for our next meeting: notepads, pens, easels, and dry erase markers. That's written out in a long sentence form. Obviously we can break that up and make it look much more appealing to a reader by changing it to a bulleted list. So instead we include, we need the following items for our next meeting, and then we have notepads, pens, easels, and dry erase markers. Notice that this is basically the same as the sentence above it. The only difference is when we have bullets, and we're still using and, it's the same exact sentence but in a bullet form. This is one example of something you can do. The next example, and the one that I frequently use, which I'm not saying you have to, but it's the one that I predominantly use, is changing it to where it's we need the following items for our next meeting, and then just listing computers, printers, fax machines, no punctuation, no and or anything. And I realized just now I left off notepads, which nothing against notepads. But the reason that I use this is because it's just easier. It's less for me. I try to be a little more efficient, I suppose. So if I can eliminate commas, punctuation, and the word and, then I'm going to certainly do that. Like I said, it's completely up to you what you want to choose to use. I'll leave that up to you. But for one thing, if you're going to choose one way, use that the same format, use that style the same way throughout the body of your text. Don't flip-flop between the two, because you don't want a lack of consistency there. That'll signal to your readers that you haven't put enough thought into developing a consistent theme in your document, which is very, very important. So, all right, that sums up everything here for today. I try to keep everything to about 20 minutes. I realize I might have gone a little bit over, but not too much.